You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Gee, Eugene, it's great to be back with you. I don't know why that came out like that. One of these days I'm going to get the opening right.
It's okay. Sometimes I say welcome back as if I didn't expect you to be here.
I almost called you Gene.
Well, there are a number of people out here who call me Gene. It's not everybody, but some people do. It's okay. I'm okay with it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the support.
Listen, many people name Eugene. It's often shortened to Gene.
Eugene.
I understand.
Eugene Debs.
Eugene Debs, one of the great Eugenes, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So many great Eugenes.
There's not a lot of us out there, Eugenes, these days. So
no,
we grab onto it wherever we can. It is good, though. Well, you know what? I'm not even going to get into that, Rania. Let's just get into the show here. The most important thing that you need to know right now is that it is the time of day of the show where you certainly should let everyone you know that you are watching the show and watching us, because we've got a lot great for you. But since you are already here on YouTube, also the time to remind you to hit subscribe and to hit the bell so that you can get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, because we got a lot of fantastic content coming out all the time here at Breakthrough News. So good to be alerted about it, because, you know, it's a lot to follow, because we are very, very prolific here, including dispatches with Rania Khalek, some good stuff coming up. Good friend of the show, Ali Abu Nima, I believe, coming up on dispatches. Always exciting.
Yes, we love Ali. He's basically like a show regular at this point on all our programs.
He is.
We have him on the Freedom site too.
He is indeed. And shout out to Ali Abu Nima for making sure I didn't download and pay for Duolingo. Which I was getting ready to do at the end of the year.
I should have asked him about that. He's been running like a hardcore campaign against them. Every time I open Twitter, Ali is like going after Duolingo.
Listen, Ali Abu Nima, the Ralph Nader of the 21st century. He is up there for consumer rights. There's no doubt about it. We got a lot of fantastic things for you here on the show. We're going to be talking about SBF and the FTX collapse. See what I did there? Of course, we'll also be talking about events in Peru. A lot happening there. We're going to be talking about the Espionage Act and a new book where you can learn all about it and how bad it is. We're going to be talking about the ongoing colonization of the Western Sahara, a topic that has been a little bit in the media recently. And we're going to circle back around to the issue of the rail strike or potential rail strike here in the United States. Rail workers are still fighting. It's not over just because Congress had their word. So we're going to check in on that fight and the overall developments there as it concerns the rail unions and the workers who really captivated, I think, a lot of the world over the course of, around the Thanksgiving holiday. So a lot here. So a good reason, like I said, to remind whoever is following you to be following at us. You know, carrier pigeon, smoke signal, telephone call, text message, you know, yelling out the window, whatever you feel you need to do, let them know, and make sure that you subscribe and hit the bell so that you can get all the alerts of all the fantastic things that are happening.
And if you want to support this show, all of our other shows, all of our content here at Breakthrough News, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Your patronage is very welcome. And you can also do something probably even easier since you're on YouTube now watching us. You can actually donate on YouTube at the bottom of the box you're watching us in. There should be a donation option. So, and if you do donate and I believe you have, I don't know, can you leave a comment or no? Is that like an old thing? We used to read comments.
I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know.
I don't know either. I should have prepared better for this.
But here's the thing: just donate, and then we'll find out if you can make a comment and if we can read it. So, I mean, you can't necessarily donate because you want it to be read, but you can be the guinea pig for Rania to find out whether or not.
Because I used to decide whose comments got read.
Well, I think that's why we ended it, because there were some complaints about how capricious you were.
I think that you're making that up. I don't believe you. I think that's a lie.
Well,
I was a great censor.
You can believe whatever you want.
Censor. All right.
All right. Well, we're going to turn
censorship.
Yes, speaking of censorship. I don't know.
Oh, wait, we're not there yet.
That's
I don't know
two stories down the line, but I like that you were on top of it today. We're going to turn first to another ridiculous issue similar to the Espionage Act, and that is everything happening with the FTX exchange and Sam Bankman-Fried and cryptocurrency writ large. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Chris Caruso, who's an economic researcher and also the operations director at the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. Chris, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Eugene and Ronnie. I'm a huge fan of the show. Absolutely indispensable information.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And we're glad to have you here because I feel like, I don't know, there's so much to wade through with the whole cryptocurrency thing. And I think a lot of people have been probably seeing the Sam Bankman-Fried. They've seen he's gotten arrested. They heard something about FTX. But maybe if you just could give us maybe a capsule view of like what this crisis is really about. Like what was this FTX and why is everyone kind of freaking out that it collapsed?
Absolutely. So FTX was the third largest crypto exchange, meaning it was a place to go and buy and sell so-called cryptocurrencies. The most famous of which is Bitcoin that people have probably heard of. The immediate cause, the kind of proximate cause, seemed to be this competition with another exchange called Binance, and that the CEO of that exchange, heavily implied that there was something suspicious happening over at FTX, which basically created a kind of classic bank run where people said, well, I'm going to get my money out of there. And then that revealed that their money was in fact already gone and that they had already been the victims of massive fraud. But this was just disclosed by this bank run that's happened in the past few weeks that took FTX from being valued as a $32 billion company to bankruptcy in a matter of less than 2 weeks. So this is very dramatic.
Chris, obviously, like a lot has been made about this particular cryptocurrency FTX and about the Sam Bankman-Fried and sort of his personal lifestyle, and also the fact that he was very close with politicians, which I want to obviously maybe talk a little bit about that too, because he did donate quite a bit of money to try to seemingly have control over those who would be tasked with regulating cryptocurrency. But actually, before we get into that, I'm curious, it's being framed also by crypto enthusiasts as like something exceptional because it was this kind of Ponzi scheme. But is it that much different than other cryptocurrencies? Because we're kind of seeing this trend, right? Where for the last, I don't know what year, all these different cryptocurrencies are either devaluing or collapsing. And it's led to a lot of questions about whether this is actually like real money, whether it might have the capability of impacting other parts of the economy. When it comes to cryptocurrency, is this more proof that it's some sort of scam, or is FTX like totally different than all the other cryptocurrencies out there?
I think that's really the key question, Rania. And I think that, the term cryptocurrency is a misnomer. They are in fact not currencies in any meaningful sense. What they are speculative digital assets. People bet on them. They hope that they might go up so that they could sell them and make money. And, what we experienced in previous years with these crypto markets was simply, the inflation of a classic asset bubble. And that bubble began to pop, when if we could date that to when it was when the Federal Reserve Bank started to raise interest rates, and this era of cheap money started to come to an end. But let's just think about this for a second. There's a certain intuitive appeal to this idea of, okay, well, I could use Bitcoin on the dark web to buy an illegal drug and have it shipped to my house so I can enjoy it, right? And people say, okay, well, I've done that, so so Bitcoin is money, cryptocurrency is currency. But of course, a means of payment is only one part of being a currency or a money. And we know that, it's very common for all kinds of things to be used as means of payment, that in the US prison system, cigarettes are used as a means of payment. If you go to Burning Man, you'll find out that Snickers bars are used as a means of payment, right? Things can be used as a means of payment that doesn't make them money. Why doesn't it make them money? Well, on the one hand, they don't scale very well, right? So if you have, you could run a Burning Man for a couple weeks on Snickers bars, but it would be hard to run a global economy using Snickers bars as money because they don't scale, right? There'd be a lot of impediments to doing all of your transactions with Snickers bars. Well, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies also have a massive scale problem, that they're deliberately very inefficient, that Bitcoin can only, settle, a handful of transactions in the same time that, old clunky non-sexy technology like Visa could settle tens of thousands in the same amount of time. And in addition, the electricity usage of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is, astonishing. It's equal to the amount of energy that the entire country of Argentina uses in a year. So it's an incredibly inefficient system that doesn't scale. But in addition to that, money, real currency, is not just a means of payment, but it's also a store of value. And that's really important, because if people work and they save and they're trying to save for retirement or pay for their kids' education or whatever, imagine, what's happened in the last year in cryptocurrencies. They've lost 70% of their value, right? Investors have lost $2 trillion. So this is an incredibly bad way to attempt to store value. And in fact, it is cryptocurrency is nothing other than a speculative digital asset. And I think actually the best analogy would be online poker. People remember that, maybe 15, 20 years ago, online poker had a kind of heyday. And I think what's great about that analogy is it's a zero-sum game, right? That, when you go and play online poker, no value is created in the world, right? It's just simply a redistribution from the sucker's money to the scamster's pockets. And in fact, that crypto is also a zero-sum game. And the vast majority of crypto investors, of which there are many millions, invested last year in 2021 when it was at its peak. And the vast majority have lost enormous amounts of money. And I think this is becoming a political question, a social and political question of especially these young men who were, seduced by this kind of libertarian ideology that is wrapped up in the cryptocurrencies, used to sell cryptocurrencies. And they all thought, they were geniuses when they were riding that asset bubble on the way up, and they were beating the system, and they were beating the man. And now as they watch, in many cases, their life savings disappear overnight, it's not likely that they're going to reevaluate and just say, well, that was a really stupid investment on my part. They're casting around looking for scapegoats right now. And I think this is a very politically explosive question, as well as an economic question.
I'm really glad you raised that, Chris, and it speaks to the next question I want to ask you is sort of, what does it even say about where we are in capitalism that, on the one hand, you have, these investors, the whole stonks thing and everything as well with how that was going, people who are just so desperate to try to use this to get rich quick. But then also, and I've noticed a number of people pointing this out, when you look at the investors in FTX, it was like every single major bank, investment houses. The type of people who allegedly are sophisticated enough to see through these kind of scams, and they also seem somewhat desperate to just get in on anything that'll get them rich quick. And it just feels, I don't know, I'm just going back to what I learned in school, that, capitalism was supposed to be this deep, robust system where you invest and you create new things that meet people's needs, and it becomes self-perpetuating. But this feels like the opposite of that kind of grade school definition.
I think it's a great point. And I think that, if capitalism was working really well, even from the point of view of the capitalists, why would they be putting trillions of dollars into, essentially just a speculative gambling enterprise? And you're right. Your intuition is absolutely right. The economy is not going really well. In fact, there's overproduction in nearly every industry in the world. And this is, can be very counterintuitive because we have enormous amounts of poverty and inequality. And it awfully much feels like there's not enough to go around, when in fact the problem is the opposite. The problem is there's actually so much overcapacity that if a rich person wants to invest and get a decent return on their money, it's difficult for them to invest in the real productive economy because it's already covered. They could already produce more stuff than we could buy with our, very low wages. In the United States, the wages for the bottom 80% of wage earners, so-called non-supervisory wage earners, have been more or less flat when adjusted for inflation since 1973. That's when the purchasing power of the American worker was at its peak, was 1973, right? So capitalism is not working well, certainly not for the working class and the poor, but increasingly, the rich are having this problem of the inequality has proceeded at such a pace. The rich have accumulated so much money at the top that they literally don't know what to do with it anymore in a way to keep accumulating more capital. So they are forced to go into these more and more speculative domains to continue to pursue a rate of return. And, many of them, which are just, vaporware, like cryptocurrency, is essentially, tulip mania without the tulips, going back to one of the kind of classic asset bubbles from early Dutch history. This is tulip mania, but with digital tokens instead of tulips. And if the economy was healthy, then this kind of stuff would be, much better regulated, even from the capitalist own point of view. But to say, briefly why it's not is simply because, they had foresight enough to spread around a lot of this money that they were taking from investors and give it to politicians. There's a massive revolving door of people that are supposed to be regulating cryptocurrencies between government and the crypto industry. And also all of these celebrity endorsers, right? There was 4 major crypto exchanges that had, high, placement in the last Super Bowl, these payments to all of these celebrities to convince people to, give away their money to these crooks like Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah. You did. You had LeBron James, you had Larry David. I think that was one of the most, that was like one of the best commercials. It was so-called one of the best commercials was with Larry David. You had Matt Damon as well, has been pushing this not just recently, but for years. Yep. And there's also been, it doesn't seem like there's any accountability. I mean, in this case with the FTX exchange and Sam Bankman-Fried, he's been arrested. But why do you think that is? Why is it that this one time there's some accountability? Like, what about all the other times when you've seen people losing all of their money? Is the fraud here just that bad?
Yeah, I do think that the scale of the fraud is, shocking. And I think, despite this kind of, the sales pitch, this kind of verbiage of, this kind of utopian California ideology mixed with, libertarianism, and then dressed up with this so-called effective altruism. This was, a story that was being sold. But in fact, the actual crime was just bald-faced, right? If I could read a quote from the new FTX head, John Ray, who took over, and he said that people were comparing FTX to Enron, who famously robbed a bunch of people. He said Enron was a highly orchestrated financial machinations by highly sophisticated people to keep transactions off of balance sheets. This, FTX, is not sophisticated whatsoever. This is just plain old embezzlement. Once you just literally scratch the surface of this kind of razzle-dazzle tech and libertarian, smokescreen, there's frighteningly little to it. In fact, SBF himself said that that the technology behind FTX was basically a Google spreadsheet. And so this is the scale of this fraud is extreme, but also You may have seen the news that there's 4 or maybe 5 relatively young tech billionaires who have mysteriously died young in the past few weeks. That enormous amounts of this money is coming from illicit activities, organized crime, international drug sales, and this is being, just old-fashioned embezzled through these exchanges. And when all that money disappears, right, it's not insured by the FDIC, right? There's nowhere to go for it. I mean, these FTX investors are not going to be able to get their money back. It'll take years, and they'll get a tiny pittance back of what they lost if they're lucky. But it sure seems as if some of these larger, less savory investors are taking matters into their own hands, and I'm sure that they don't want that to get too out of control as well.
No, I think that's a very, very good point. Well, there's a lot here. I mean, it's quite a rabbit hole given everything we've been sold. So we'll have to keep bringing you back and keep following this, Chris. But we really appreciate you joining us to help us at least start to sort through some of all this morass.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And again, that was Chris Caruso of the Kairos Center. Yeah, I mean, Rania, to be honest with you, I had like 10 more questions, but I was like, no, we'll never be able to finish this.
He was great. We'll have
so
to
we're
get
going to have
him
to bring Chris
on.
back because there's so much more to say about cryptocurrency, the countries that are coming in, do you want to correct yourself because you said FTX was a cryptocurrency, not an exchange?
Eugene, why would you do that? Why would you do that? 2 things. I want to correct myself. I'm sorry I called it a cryptocurrency when it's an exchange.
Okay. It's all fake anyway.
The other thing too is the reason I started like giggling at a time when it seemed like, why is she laughing, is because I think it was Matt put on the lower third Sam Bankman-Fried, and it made me laugh because that's how I am.
Thanks for that. I think we got it. I think the listeners got it, but I appreciate the clarification.
I just wanted to make sure.
What's important is that you care about those who are watching. I said listeners, so we're all struggling. Listen, circle back around with us after the holidays, all right? We're in that moment. Well, we want to circle around to another crucially important issue. That's what's happening in the country of Peru in Latin America. And we are very, very honored to be joined by a good friend of the show, Zoe Alexandra, who's a journalist, of course, co-editor of the indispensable PeoplesDispatch, and covers social movements really all around the world, but especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. Zoe, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you.
Well, we're glad to have you. Pleasure's all ours, if you might say. Peru, I think that most people probably have seen that there are things happening in Peru, that the president was arrested, that there are big protests happening, but I think it's probably somewhat mysterious to people, the whole provenance of it, because the politics there have been relatively complicated. So maybe just give us a capsule view of why the president is no longer the president, who the new president is, and why people are protesting.
Well, it's been just over a week since Pedro Castillo was overthrown essentially in a parliamentary coup. Everything happened in the span of maybe 6 hours, where there was kind of a political institutional stalemate, but it really ended in his arrest and his overthrow. But the events of last Wednesday have a longer history to them, and they have to do with the process of Pedro Castillo being elected, the intense resistance to his election as president in the country. So I'll give a little bit of the background because I think it's important to understand that what we're seeing happening today is really a buildup and really the culmination of a year and a half of, pressure against Castillo, pressure against his government. So Pedro Castillo was elected in the June 2021 in the second round of the elections. And if people remember, it was a really much a surprise victory because in the first round of presidential elections in Peru, there were 5 candidates that were kind of tied with around 18%, centrist candidates, progressive candidate, but Pedro Castillo didn't factor in. No one knew who he was, but he ended up winning the first round of the elections, but it was a pretty low percentage because there were so many candidates and so many different kind of platforms. He won this first round. People were shocked. They said, "Who's Pedro Castillo? I've never heard of his name." In all of the pre-election articles, you wouldn't even see him mentioned because he was such an insignificant candidate to so many people. And this really, goes to show this kind of the whole perspective towards him. But he wins the first round. He goes on to face off against Keiko Fujimori, who's the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, former dictator in Peru. And they face off in June. He emerges victorious with a small margin, about 1.5% in these elections in June 2021. And what follows is almost a month where the far right uses every single trick in the book, using the courts, using allegations of electoral fraud, of course, using the media to essentially put pressure on him, trying to say that this election was fraudulent, trying to say that really he didn't win the elections. And eventually he is proclaimed victorious, but it's already in the situation of destabilization, an attempt to kind of undermine him as a president, undermine the force and the power that he's going to have as president. And of course, it's important to say that in the general elections in 2021, a very, very far-right Congress was elected. And so he is not only facing kind of the fury of the far right that lost in these elections, but a far right that has power in the Congress. And I mention this because it's really comes into play with what happened last week. Pedro Castillo is proclaimed victorious. He's actually sworn in almost days later. So it's a really long process of where they say he's not even president of the country. And essentially from that day on, it was a complete power struggle. The far right in the judiciary, in the Congress, in the media, putting pressure on his cabinet. Many ministers were forced to resign. They launched 2 impeachment motions against him, open up investigations against him and members of his party, members of his cabinet for fraud, for corruption, for all sorts of different charges. And so during the 16 months that he's serving as president, he's kind of facing, those photos of where someone's surrounded by spears. That's kind of Pedro Castillo in these 16 months as president, constantly fighting off attacks from the right, constantly fighting off threats to investigate him, to all these other things. For example, he was invited to a meeting in Mexico, and the Congress prohibited him from leaving the country. So even before he was overthrown in a coup, he was already having his political rights extremely restricted. So that brings us to last Wednesday, where the Congress was going to vote on another impeachment or vacancy motion, as they call it there. And essentially, Pedro Castillo made a gamble, and he said, okay, this is the 3rd impeachment measure. They're gaining a lot of strength. And you know what? I'm going to take strong moves. I'm going to attempt to push forward the idea of the Constituent Assembly, which was always a campaign promise of him, to rewrite the Constitution that was put into place during the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori. And I'm going to dissolve the Congress and and several other bodies that have been really central in this right-wing attack against him. Hours later, the Congress, where he just dissolved, votes to impeach him, and he's arrested. Since then, he's been in prison. His family was very rudely and violently escorted out of the presidential palace. They attempted to actually go to the Mexican embassy to be given refuge, but they were arrested on their way. And this is what has essentially unfolded. Since then, on Wednesday, there's been massive protests across the country. And I mean across the country. We're not just talking in Lima, but really in the highlands and the mountainous regions. Agrarian unions, miners' unions, they've all been on the streets, closing local airports, mobilizing and rejecting this coup, calling for the Constituent Assembly to be held definitively, calling for Dina Boluarte, who was his vice president and took over as president following his impeachment, to be taken out, calling for the Congress to close, and essentially just expressing their anger with this far-right political machine that's made life impossible for them for the past couple of years, and to be able to have a say in the political life in the country.
Well, it's interesting that you're saying all that, Zoe, because if you read the American news media, it's being portrayed as Pedro Castillo tried to launch a coup, and now people are protesting against him. That's actually how I've seen various mainstream media outlets in the U.S. Frame it. But interestingly enough, this is a different Latin America than we had 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even last year, you could say. So what's been the reaction? I mean, now we have so many more center-left and left-wing governments across the region. Has there been support for Pedro Castillo? Has there been support at least against this coup? And also, is there any role the Organization of American States has been playing in other coups around the region?
Well, definitely. There's been a lot of solidarity behind Pedro Castillo. Even before he was overthrown, as I said, he had a planned scheduled visit to Mexico, and his Congress essentially blocked him from leaving the country. Already then, Andrés Manuel López Obrador had already been denouncing the moves of this right wing Congress against him. And since then, countries and governments across the region have really been expressing their support. Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, and Colombia penned a letter in support of him. Other countries have also essentially said that he is the constitutional president, and what's happening right now is a subversion of the constitutional order, and that the protests that are happening, in which it's important to point out over 8 people have been killed by repressive forces, that these protests must be respected, that the human rights of the Peruvian people be respected. There's a lot of comparisons to what's happening to Pedro Castillo, comparisons to Bolivia when Evo was overthrown, and all of the threats that he faced to his life and the extreme repression faced by the people who were protesting the coup. So there's been a lot of, I think, because that's in such recent history, that was only 2019, a lot of people are seeing this with a lot of fear. In those protests in Bolivia, over 37 people were killed by repressive forces, and who were given actually a mandate by Janine Áñez that they wouldn't be prosecuted, that they wouldn't face any retribution for the crimes that they committed. So I think this case right now in Peru is really similar, and it's also happened in the same week that Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was sentenced to 6 years in prison. So I think people are able to connect the dots. That being said, as you mentioned, there is a very strong narrative being pushed forward by liberal media, by right-wing media as well, trying to demonize this, saying that Pedro Castillo subverted the Constitution, that he was the one who was trying to seize power. But I think, as you said, because of the correlation of forces in the region, having more progressive governments, understanding that they also are going to be or have already been targeted by this same kind of violence, this same kind of right wing that refuses to let up their grip on the power.
Yeah, I mean, it really is somewhat unbelievable. I mean, when you look at the context of this, I mean, it just feels what is the possible through line or the possible solution? Because it feels like the sort of traditional constitutional order, I mean, I know you can't say that, of the country has totally collapsed. I mean, no one has been able to reach any sort of consensus. I mean, what's behind that? I mean, is it these class struggle elements you're pointing to? But I mean, it does seem that this is oddly tumultuous, if you will, the inability of sort of any political actor to really gain even slight hegemony.
Definitely. Peru has one House of Congress. That might be an element. A lot of the political system, as I said, was created, and the infrastructure of this is from the 1993 Constitution, which was drafted during the time of Alberto Fujimori, wherein they wanted to create a political system where the right wing could really maintain control. There's so many elements to this. The fact that the media is dominated by corporations, that the media is not democratic. I mean, there's so many things, and I think we can look to other examples of countries that have gone through constituent processes where they try to make more democratic constitutions. And it's not just about how the Congress is formed or one thing or another, but it's really every single aspect of society, whether it's media, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, all of these create a stronger society where there can be political participation from the oppressed minorities, where there can be kind of a breaking this stronghold that the right wing has. And I think Peru is one of the classic examples of a neoliberal model where the right wing does have all these advantages to its favor, where there's privatization of a lot of key public resources. We can look at how Peru handled the pandemic. It was a disaster. I remember images of right in the middle of the pandemic, a huge homeless encampment that was evicted. And it was about, I think, hundreds and hundreds of families that were evicted in the middle of the pandemic. And this is kind of the epitome of Peru. And it's a country that's often forgotten. I think we focus a lot on the socialist miracles of Latin America, or the ones that, or the villains that we know a lot, which is maybe Colombia. But Peru is another one of these countries that has a very strong neoliberal model, that has a lot of social unrest, and especially because of the legacy of the armed struggle in the country, this is a huge element. So any factor, any group that's left, any group that's any way associated with Marxism, with communism, is also faces the threat of being linked to rebellion to terrorism. This is a huge accusation from the right wing against left wing groups in the country. And this is something they still have to contend with. So there's so many different elements of what makes the right wing be able to hold on to this fear, to be able to hold on to their power and essentially impose their dominance.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, I assume that People's Dispatch is going to be covering this very closely, in the coming days. You've already been covering it very closely, but anything that people should be looking forward to in terms of your coverage moving forward?
Well, I'm actually flying out to Lima tomorrow. We're going to be on the ground, of course, giving important content to our friends at Breakthrough News. We're going to be covering for People's Dispatch, attempting to give voice to the people who are on the streets, because we've heard a lot about the protests. We're hearing that these people are against Pedro Castillo, these people are for Pedro, but there's very little being heard from actually the people who are on the ground. So we're hoping to be able to talk to these massive trade unions who are going to be organized. As of today, there's nationwide indefinite strike. People are blocking airports, blocking highways, mobilizing in all of the major areas of the country. So we're going to be speaking to those people, learning why they're on the streets, and hopefully doing some of that coverage.
Mm-hmm. Well, People's Dispatch, as always, place to be for extensive coverage of people's movements all around the world. And as always, Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Rania, it's quite the situation. I'll be very curious to hear more from on the ground from people themselves, because we are hearing a lot of other people's interpretations. Also, just want to shout out Martin Hernandez for your donation. Really appreciate that. I have to say, Martin Hernandez may be the most consistent donor to this show, I have to say.
Definitely.
Mr. 13FNG, if you're out there, you're also up there. But Martin Hernandez may be the most consistent.
And if anybody else wants to get a shout out like that, you know what you got to do?
You got to donate every single show. That's what you have to do.
Exactly.
You can't just do it once. You got to be consistent.
You're raising your new goalposts here.
Hey, it's not a goalpost. I'm just going after what Mr. Martin Hernandez has done. Well, we are going to keep the show moving forward here. Another very important issue, and that is the Espionage Act in the United States, and especially how it has been wielded against the press and against political activists, and the Venn diagram where those two things are at least accused of meeting. And we are very, very happy to be joined by Kerry Schenkman, who's an attorney, he's a litigator. He specializes in human rights and constitutional law, but I have to say, he's the co-author of A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act, and Freedom of the Press, with Mr. Ralph Engelman. Kerry, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, of course. I think my hand was in the way. I'm going to hold that up one more time so people can see. There you go. There it is for real. Kerry, I think in some ways people have probably heard snippets about the Espionage Act, especially those who are following the case of Julian Assange. But, maybe just to give us some framing here as we get into it, what is this Espionage Act and why was it originally passed? And I believe it was 1917.
Yeah, so this law has been around for over 100 years. And actually the title of our book is A Century of Repression. Because I think when we talk about the case of Julian Assange, when we talk about the modern whistleblower cases, I think there is an absence of context. And there is a 100-year political context when we go back to the passage of this law and the way that's been used over the last 100 years, really against the left as a tool for information control. So 1917, of course, was the year of U.S. entry into World War I. And that really frames the context of how this law was passed. Actually, Woodrow Wilson kicked off the suite of legislation, if you will, that was used to go after the Socialist Party, to go after the labor movements at the time, during his speech calling for U.S. entry into the war. And actually, the U.S. had stayed out of what they considered this European issue, but then shifted course. And in doing so, Wilson said that he wanted to treat any disloyalty or dissent with, quote, a firm hand of stern repression. I'm not making that up. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual language that he used in a speech before Congress. And just within the next few months, the Espionage Act was passed as part of different legislation as well, including a sedition act, the first sedition act that the country had seen in over 200 years. So the repression of World War I think, really frames the period that followed. And as I mentioned, World War I really was one of the most politically vibrant periods in the history of the U.S., with the Socialist Party and Eugene Debs stronger than it had ever been. The Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, had such a strong presence in the country, and they were targeted. The first 2,000 plus prosecutions under the Espionage Act were of the Wobblies, were of the Socialist Party. They didn't actually involve espionage, and that's honestly one of the core misconceptions that we try to tackle in this book. And if you take nothing else from this segment, the most important thing to realize is that even though it's called an Espionage Act, it is not about espionage as you or I would casually understand that term to mean.
Yeah, I mean, it really is about chilling free speech at the end of the day. And it's really fantastic marketing if you think about it. I mean, to call it an Espionage Act, because that is what people think. They think it means, oh, these are spies, these are traitors.
Right.
But can you, bring us from then to now in terms of how is the Espionage Act being used today? Of course, we're seeing it be used against Julian Assange. The Espionage Act hasn't exactly been used many times since then. Are there other figures that you can highlight where this has been used to try to attack or suppress their work? And then in terms of Julian Assange, how is it being used?
Absolutely. So during World War I, like I mentioned, it was used against dissidents and the anti-war movement. And the reason that was possible was because of broad language in the law that punished aspects like disloyalty, any opposition to the war effort. And the act had since been amended to turn into more of a tool of information control. And it was around the beginning of the Cold War that we saw this shift to prosecute government sources of what's called national defense information, or folks that revealed information about U.S. foreign policy or military efforts abroad. Actually, kind of a fascinating thread that we uncovered were different uses of the act that aren't well known. So it was used during World War I and actually during World War II in the interwar period to go after the black press. For example, publications like the Chicago Defender were some of the most prominent anti-war voices as well, because one of the questions was, well, why are African Americans being forced to fight in wars abroad when we don't even have civil rights at home? In the rise of the career of J. Edgar Hoover, that was actually seen as seditious, and he was, of course, deeply racist, and his philosophies were actually shaped by the Espionage Act and this legislation in World War I. And so we saw actually those threads. We saw the Espionage Act be central to actually the case that literally sparked the McCarthyist Red Scare, because in 1945 and onward, there was an investigation of several State Department employees that were leaking to the press about the situation in China. And several of those defendants at the time, an Espionage Act case were named by McCarthy in his famous Wheeling, Virginia speech that literally kicked off the Red Scare. So those politically, we see kind of the intersection of, as you pointed out, the branding of these cases as espionage when they really weren't espionage at all. They were folks that were revealing information in the public interest. Zoom forward, so we're talking about things like the Red Scare, going after the black press. How does that take us to today with the case of Julian Assange, with whistleblowers? What we've seen over the last 100 years is this gradual escalation of this law being used against the press. And there were moments when successive administrations got closer and closer to that line, but didn't cross it, either due to political pressures or legal issues. One of the most famous cases of that was the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, when Daniel Ellsberg was prosecuted as a source for historical studies showing that the Johnson and Nixon administrations were lying to the public about the Vietnam War. Famously, Nixon tried to go after the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers who published the the Pentagon Papers. But of course, those prosecutions and attempted prosecutions ultimately failed. During the Reagan administration and the rise of the modern national security apparatus, publications and journalists that investigated and wrote books on the NSA and other agencies were actually investigated under the Espionage Act as well. But of course, these ended at threats until today, when we see prosecutions like that of Chelsea Manning, of Edward Snowden, and other government insiders, including Daniel Hale, who is an alleged intercept source for the U.S. drone program. He's currently held in a communications management unit where he has difficulty even talking to his lawyers. And of course, as you pointed out, the case of Julian Assange. And the case against Assange is absolutely unprecedented, both legally and politically, because it crosses a line that no administration has dared to cross in the past. Reagan didn't do it, even Nixon didn't do it. And finally, the Trump administration decided to. And that line was to prosecute someone for the act of publication. And if you read actually the criminal complaint, the 3 indictments against Assange, there's a lot of talk that, he's being prosecuted for hacking or a hacking conspiracy. Actually, for the dozens and dozens of paragraphs in that indictment, there's only 3 paragraphs that talk about any alleged computer intrusion offenses. And even then, it's talking about alleging an attempt at an attempt. The rest of it actually describes national security journalism. Literally, we're talking about use of anonymity tools. We're talking about having an alleged relationship with the source. And we're talking about literally publication, which is a line that's never been crossed in U.S. history.
I think that feels incredibly important, that last point there, Carrie, the implications if the line is crossed. I mean, we've seen the implications of even just the threat of using it in the past and the way it's been wielded prior. I mean, talk about that, if you will, if the precedent is set for someone like Assange to be prosecuted in this way. What does it mean going forward what does it mean going forward, I guess, is the real question.
Absolutely. So I think what's super important for folks to realize, Julian Assange is not a U.S. government employee. He never signed any agreement with the U.S. government to adhere to classified information protocols, any of that. In addition, he is not even a U.S. citizen. So in terms of the precedent, this is really terrifying because it would assert that the Justice Department has jurisdiction over literally anyone on Earth for publishing materials that the U.S. deems would expose information that it doesn't want to see exposed. And this prospect is literally terrifying because on the flip side, you have U.S. officials who are leaking information for personal gain on a daily basis. You open the New York Times, the Post, any of these mainstream papers, any day, there's classified information everywhere, but it's self-serving. I mean, you go back several years to General David Petraeus, who famously was providing code word level information to his biographer and mistress, and he was given a slap on the wrist and is now making 6 figures on speaking tours. So what we're really seeing is the failure of due process, the failure of real justice, because it's up to political considerations at that point to consider who gets prosecuted. In terms of the legal implications of the case, as I mentioned, the conduct that's described in the Assange indictment is a publication, is a journalist-source relationships, is the use of anonymity tools. There are folks that say things like, well, Assange is not a journalist. That's, I think, disingenuous, given that most mainstream media outlets now are utilizing methods that WikiLeaks pioneered, such as publishing libraries of original documents, such as using source protection anonymity tools, like, for instance, Secure Drop, which was directly motivated and modeled after WikiLeaks methods. Literally almost every mainstream organization uses those. So it's disingenuous, first of all, to say that, well, Assange isn't a journalist. But on top of that, that view is legally irrelevant. it claims that the First Amendment and human rights protections only apply to some special category of people called that meet the club of journalism, when in fact, by design, they're meant to protect everyone. So there's no legal distinction between Julian Assange and you and me, and that's really why the stakes of this case are so high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Carrie, really appreciate you. And there are, of course, many superlatives, but I want to just say, most importantly, you are the author of A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act, and Freedom of the Press, along with Ralph Engelman. Fantastic book. I really enjoyed it myself, and I can't recommend it any higher. And we really appreciate you coming on to help us sort through some of this. Oh, I'm not. There we go. All right.
I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was just me. I was like, can I not hear? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Something might have happened. But yeah, great book, Century of Repression. I really can recommend it. I know you can get it here in New York City at 1804 Books. I'm sure you can get it from everywhere else. But if you're in New York City, if you can get on 1804 Books online, you can definitely get it from there. And I would highly recommend you do that instead of, one of these other entities that is out there. Well, we're going to keep moving. Do want to shout out Milivoje Milosevic. Hopefully I got your first name right there, but nice donation. Also an anonymous donation. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. And now we want to move to another very important issue, and that is the ongoing colonization of Western Sahara, as it's popularly known. And we are very happy to be joined for this conversation by Mahjoub Maliha, who is the head of the External Relations Committee of CODESA. It's the collective of Sahrawi human rights defenders in the Western Sahara. Mahjoub, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you, Ron. Pleased to be with you.
Well, we're really pleased to have you, and I think this is an issue that many people around the world, unfortunately, are just catching up to, maybe because of recent events in the sporting world. So maybe just to give us some context here, many people call the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, or Western Sahara, the last colony in Africa. So explain to us, what is the status of Western Sahara currently?
It is indeed Western Sahara is the last colony in Africa that was occupied by Spain up to 1975, when Spain decided to illegally withdraw from the territory without completing the self-determination process and allowing the Sahrawi people to organize themselves under the Sahrawi Republic. So when they were deciding to leave, they opted to divide the territory of Western Sahara between the two neighboring countries, Morocco from the north and Mauritania from the south, who divided territory for a while, and the Polisario Front, which is the liberation movement of the Sahrawi people and the legal representative of the Sahrawi people, did not agree on that division outside the law and in contradiction with the UN Charter. So there was a war started against both Morocco and Mauritania for expanding and annexing part of the territory of Western Sahara up to 1991. With Morocco, Mauritania in 1979 decided to withdraw its claim over Western Sahara, recognize the Sahrawi Republic, which was after that a member of the African Union. Morocco decided to continue the invasion of Western Sahara, continued the war until 1991, where the UN brokered the ceasefire between Morocco and the Polisario Front in a promise to organize a referendum to allow the people of Western Sahara to decide their political future in a referendum. The UN mission, MINURSO, was created in 1991 to oversee and overlook the implementation of that self-determination. And until today, that self-determination and referendum never took place because Morocco was always blocking that from happening, knowing that the Sahrawis will choose for being independent. The situation right now, in November 2020, basically in the same time when Trump decided to issue a proclamation recognizing the claimed sovereignty of Morocco over Western Sahara, there is a war back, a resumption of hostilities between Morocco and the Sahrawi Liberation Army, alongside the the berm or the separation wall, as Western Sahara territory is divided in two parts. The liberated zones located on the west side of the berm or the separation wall, and the occupied territories, on the west side, the liberated zone on the east side of the berm. And the separation wall is 2,700 long, 2,700 kilometers long wall with millions of anti-personnel landmines. Morocco continued to basically exploit and plunder the natural resources in the occupied territories of Western Sahara, keeping the people of Western Sahara living in the occupied territories under repression and abuses, discrimination, and all kind of occupation, military occupation acts in occupied territories. We see also long ongoing crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by the Moroccan occupation in Western Sahara, starting from the separation, of course, in terms of in a violation of the national unity and territorial integrity of the Sahrawi people and Western Sahara. We see also the demographic engineering, demographic change that Morocco is orchestrating in Western Sahara by pushing thousands of Moroccans into the territory to basically change demography in a settlement policy. In the meanwhile, we see also a lot of major players, including the EU and the US, taking or holding major responsibility besides Spain, of course, of leaving the situation in Western Sahara deteriorating year after year without any political will or serious actions from the United Nations Security Council towards completing the decolonization process in Western Sahara. So that's a bit a quick overview. Yeah, please.
No, that was an excellent overview, and I actually wanted you to elaborate a bit on that because the U.S. obviously one of the last things that Donald Trump did as president was he had the U.S. recognize Moroccan sovereignty over occupied Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco normalizing relations with Israel. How did that impact the conflict, and who would you say is the biggest obstacle to peace now?
Well, indeed, that proclamation from Trump didn't make things easier or smoother, or even didn't encourage the peace process in Western Sahara. And by the way, there is a settlement plan proposed by the African Union and United Nations back in 1991, which both parties have agreed upon, but the US or the Trump proclamation made things too complicated, encouraging Morocco basically to step out from its obligations and the initial plan that was agreed upon. And second is also to consider the Trump proclamation as a green light to continue the crimes against humanity and war crimes they are committing in Western Sahara against civilian Sahrawis. So basically, the Trump proclamation was a shame a historical shame on the U.S. administration to go against the U.S. fundamental principle, knowing that the United States was founded based on the fundamental right to self-determination, and by this act undermining the same or the very same fundamental right. That could not be acceptable, nor in line with international law that consider Western Sahara a non-self-governing territory awaiting the decolonization process, still listed under the Fourth Committee of the United Nations, which handles the decolonization process in almost around 17 territories around the world. The international law is very clear when it comes to Western Sahara. And in multiple occasions, starting from the International Court of Justice back in 1975, and recently developed rulings from the EU Court of Justice and even the African Court for Human and People's Rights, that all confirm that Morocco has no sovereignty whatsoever in Western Sahara, and that Western Sahara and Morocco are separate and distinct territories. And of course, the Sahrawi people's right to self-determination cannot be cannot be undermined in relation with the natural resources. Of course, in exploitation of natural resources in Western Sahara cannot be illegal or in line with international law without securing the consent of the Sahrawi people, and that consent cannot be obtained without the Polisario Front, which is the legal representative of the Sahrawi people.
You know, I was hoping you could also talk more about an issue I know you mentioned in your opening here about the human rights abuses. I mean, I think just about every organization out there that claims to be a human rights organization has over many decades laid out that this is the case, that Morocco is having some very serious human rights violations. I know there's also political prisoners as well being held. So talk about that if you could.
Yeah, indeed. And today, actually, we are celebrating the release of one of our colleagues, a member of CODESA, Jamal Harouche, who was released after spending 15 months of arbitrary detention for no reason but supporting or defending the right to self-determination of the Sahrawi people. So Morocco, in continuous basis and in systematic basis, implement policies starting from the forced allegiance imposed on Sahrawis in the occupied territories, bread, incomes, food against allegiance to the Moroccan occupation in Western Sahara. We see house arrest, siege imposed on neighborhoods, cities, and also, of course, the human rights defenders, activists, and journalists are primary targets for the Moroccan occupation forces in Western Sahara. We have also, since the invasion, massacres, mass graves in Western Sahara that are still to be discovered after 45 years now. We have over 500 disappeared Sahrawis whose fate still unknown. Some may have died in secret prisons in Morocco. We have also hundreds of victims of physical abuses. Last year, for instance, we have noted or reported over 800 cases. I've noted 25 killing outside the law or extradition. We have also seen the situation that Sahrawi political prisoners suffer from inside the Moroccan prisons, kept outside the territory against the law, outside the occupied territory of Western Sahara, and sent to Moroccan prisons thousands of kilometers away from their families. So all kind of discrimination, abuses that military occupation can commit are basically committed in Western Sahara on a daily basis.
And what should be done to resolve this conflict? I mean, in a perfect world, what should the EU and the US be doing? What should the international community be doing so that this isn't happening anymore, to end this occupation?
It is actually, well, the international media or international actors try to tag the Western Sahara question as a complicated issue, but it is actually a very easy question to solve, while the legal bases are already in place and very clear, cannot be doubted or misinterpreted. The international community must have the courage and the will to support, defend peace, and defend the fundamental principles of humanity, the principles of the United Nations. The Security Council should step up and take serious actions toward implementing its own resolutions at first, and of course defending and protecting the international legality and international law in Western Sahara. We cannot be having double standards as we look at the war in Ukraine or Russia-Ukraine. We see the entire world going crazy about the annexation, what they call the annexation, or the situation in Ukraine. But in Western Sahara, it has been ongoing for over 50 years. There was an annexation, there is a continuous annexation, there is plunder of natural resources against the law, but no one basically say it as it is, and the time of double standards has to be part of the past, and the international community should take its responsibility in order to be taken serious in the future.
One thing I'm also wondering is I think many people probably hearing for this for the first time, or maybe hearing more than the little bit they've seen, might be wondering, what they could do, where they could go, not only to learn more, but perhaps to show their own solidarity. What would you advise people watching who are interested in learning more and perhaps taking action?
Yeah, absolutely. People who are interested in following the news of Western Sahara can follow our organization, CODESA. Our social media pages, we post almost everything about what's happening in the occupied territories of Western Sahara. And of course, we will be happy to interact and provide all the information that can help to understand more the situation on the ground in Western Sahara.
Well, as always, we really appreciate you joining us, Makjoub, and it's a very important issue, and we'll certainly continue to cover it here on Breakthrough News. But thanks for giving us a little bit of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for your time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ron, you have an important issue. I'm glad we were able to cover it. Completely ridiculous, quite frankly. The AU, is speaking out in Western Sahara. This is a huge issue in a lot of different places, and a lot of different countries have lifted up their voices. Venezuela, I know, is another one. Cuba, others. And, of course, the United Nations, as was pointed out by Makjoub. So this is total violation, very similar to the Israeli apartheid in Palestine. I think it's notable, as you pointed out, that sort of the Trump recognition came in train with the normalization of the relations with Israel by Morocco. And in a weird way, that actually does seem right, because the two things are both totally illegal settler colonial occupations. So, yeah, it's an important one, but unfortunately it's one that, flies under the radar in terms of a lot of the international conversation. Maybe it's because it's in Africa, I don't know, and everything in Africa flies under the radar, but deserves a lot of coverage, I think.
Of course. No, absolutely. And it goes without saying that the U.S. is a huge supporter of this and helps make it possible. And we know
Spain,
that,
too.
The world is right. And we know that the world is split into bad guys and good guys. And the good guys are allies of the United States who do as the U.S. wants. And the bad guys are anybody who doesn't. And it's as black and white as that. And so if Morocco is a good American, ally, is on the side of imperialism and empire, they can do whatever they want, that's just the way it is. It's the world we live in. So, so important that we're able to provide a platform to talk about this issue, because it really is completely undercovered. If it's not even covered at all, really.
Yeah.
I don't think most Americans have any clue about the issue of Western Sahara.
No, I think that's true. Once we just had PeoplesDispatch, they had a great article called Africa's Last Colony maybe about a month ago. Brother Paul out of Poland, who was just there actually in Western Sahara with the Progressive International delegation, which I think they also made a short video of that, which is worth checking out, the Progressive International as well, but a couple other recent things on Western Sahara. But it's notable in a way that this is brought up that we're bringing up an African issue. Obviously, as we're sitting here this week, Rania, I think it actually might be wrapping up today technically, but the U.S.-Africa Summit hosted by President Joe Biden is in full swing, and certainly everyone getting their photo ops. I don't know if there's that much happening in terms of substance. The big thing that is out is that they're going to spend $55 billion over the next 3 years, allegedly, in Africa. Most of that seems to be pre-existing money around some long-standing programs like, around tuberculosis, around HIV, AIDS. America has a long-standing, large commitment to public health programs there. Some of it is the money that's already been discussed, that we discussed on the show, Rania, with POX from NUMSA, the largest union in South Africa, around climate change and allegedly for just transitions. And the rest, who knows exactly how it's going to be spent. I believe it was Antony Blinken said, we're going to shower you with the details as the week goes on. I've not been showered with the details, but there are different things that you can see. For instance, there is an accord between DRC and Zambia that basically is going to try to get the lithium in those countries and have it linked to the U.S. supply chain for EVs and electric vehicles, which There's a lot to that. I can't break all that down right now, but I think it does actually just show how much U.S. relations with Africa have not changed, because, of course, the conversation in Africa is how to not just be a primary commodity exporter, but how to start building things in Africa so they're selling products, not just their riches, to these countries like the United States. But if you follow the electric vehicle conversation in the U.S., and Blinken is saying we're going to have the Exim Bank work with them, USAID, so on and so forth, to secure this supply chain. But if you follow the EV conversation in terms of the bills that have been passed by Congress, endorsed by the president, all of the subsidies for battery manufacturers and for electric vehicle manufacturers essentially require the batteries in the vehicles to be constructed in the United States, or at least with a very large component being either in the United States or in the NAFTA countries. But even that is, the non-United States, Canada, and Mexico, different things. So basically you have the U.S. saying, oh, we're doing this great thing. Look how great we are. We've got DRC and Zambia working together. We're going to help them with their lithium, blah, blah, blah. But it's really just to take it and bring it to the United States so U.S. companies can make the finished products and sell them in electric vehicles that they'll then sell back to Africa.
So Elon Musk, so Elon Musk can make his Teslas, yeah.
Yes, it really truly is exactly what it is, and it's being presented as something different, but I could go on for a long time, Ronnie, I know we have a little bit of time, but almost everything about the summit so far to me has been, more or less really exactly why the U.S. relationship with Africa is so bad. It's just doubling down on the same old, go exploit the resources kind of mentality. They're doing little cosmetic things like Rwanda, and I think Nigeria signed some, space program thing related to the Artemis. But, China's been shooting satellites into space for Nigeria and other African countries for 10 years. And you don't hear that, you don't see that. So on so many different levels, what we're seeing is, honestly, not that dissimilar from the ASEAN summit last year, there is a ton of just cosmetic stuff, photo ops. Most of the African leaders are there. Some aren't for reasons that are mainly ridiculous, but everyone's kind of there, shaking hands, having meetings, putting it on their social media, looking like they're important because they're meeting with these different U.S. people. The U.S. people are looking like they care about Africa because they're having all these meetings. But at the end of the day, they're pledging less money over 3 years than they've given to Ukraine in less than 1 year. So, it's just obvious that there's a ridiculousness to the whole thing.
It's interesting too if you juxtapose it with, for example, the China meeting, or the Chinese president going to Saudi Arabia for a summit last week with all of these Middle Eastern leaders, and just the substance of the way that China discusses and sort of signs these memorandums and these agreements with countries versus the way that the United States does it. It just occurred to me how different it couldn't be more different in terms of just a level of mutual respect, mutually beneficial kind of relationship where it's not like some imperial power coming and imposing itself. And then also the US does this all the time. I feel like every year, at least 2 or 3 times, we hear some pledge of billions of dollars. And then when you look into it, to Africa or to any part of the world, but always in terms of Africa, there'll be a pledge of tens of billions of dollars. And then you look into it and it's really just a bunch of money going to various NGOs that was already going to them to do the same things that they're already doing. Or to some extractive industry that's just going to benefit the US and maybe an elite class, a tiny handful of elites in some capitalist African country that is extremely unequal and it's not going to make its way down to the rest of the population, that sort of situation. Whereas you see the sort of agreements that China's making with countries, and it's not, I'm not saying China's perfect, but it certainly is we're going to invest in your infrastructure. We're going to help you build these things, and we're going to get this out of it, and you're going to get that out of it. And also without all the moralizing. That's the other thing. I don't actually know if with this summer, because I wasn't following it as closely as you, Eugene, but the U.S., I imagine at some point, Joe Biden was finger wagging at some countries, if not publicly, certainly privately, because we know the U.S. loves to do that. I wonder what the conversation was, for example, with the Ethiopian prime minister, which there was a photo op of. But China also doesn't do that. There's no finger wagging and moralizing and this kind of condescending tone that interferes with the internal dynamics of a country that you would get from the U.S.
No, I think it's a good point. And you know, a lot of things that could be said about Abiy Ahmed being there with Joe Biden, but the thing that was most notable to me, I've done a little bit of research on this, so I'm open to being fact checked. But it also appeared to me that President Buhari of Nigeria, who also had a soccer game photo op with Biden, that he was in the same seat as Abiy Ahmed. So it seems to me that it's possible at some point during the game they just like switched out Africans so that everyone could have their kind of FaceTime. And to me, that in a way says it all, that a lot of the sort of, you know, the Biden and African leaders, it's like him interacting with different African leaders at the big events with everybody. And I guess you could argue, oh, he doesn't want to single people out, blah, 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 blah. But it really just feels like, even when you compare it to, say, China, that they don't put the same care into even showing that they care to people beyond anything else. But again, the substance, I mean, you talk about Ethiopia. I mean, the U.S. is still, you know, saying that AGOA, which is, you know, a so-called trade deal that the Ethiopia was removed from, they can only be brought back if they allow what essentially is a so-called human rights investigation. There already was one, but it's like a different one now, pushed by people who hate the government of Abiy Ahmed, to go and basically slander the government of Ethiopia and also Eritrea, do a whole different report that will say, I guess, all the things that these people weren't happy with the first UN report, what it didn't say. And of course, it'll probably open up officials to the ICC in both of those countries, which I'm sure is exactly what will happen, is they'll open some sort of ICC investigation. So it's like none of that has actually been addressed, but then you still want to have a photo op, which in a way, I personally feel like you got to criticize these African leaders, too, for having no agenda. I mean, you have this huge summit of African leaders in the United States, U.S.-Africa relations. I mean, it seems like it should be in Africa. I mean, that's just one. I mean, it's, you know, 54 African countries, one America. But on top of that, there is no positive go-forward agenda from these African countries. I mean, you've got some people, and I've seen them, and, you know, the president of Ghana had some whole speech about how Africans shouldn't be begging in Western countries, even though he right now, by the way, is negotiating an IMF loan to implement structural adjustment on his own people. So I guess it's okay when he begs, but maybe other people shouldn't. You know, you've got all these leaders coming, and they have no agenda. I mean, even things like AGOA and market access, there is no agenda for how to advance it. There's no discourse around it. There's no unified positions. You know, in the context of African solutions to African problems, there's no real proposals on how the U.S. should interface, if at all, with the various different peace processes and things like that, and contributions and so on and so forth. So it's sort of like they are just as complicit as Biden in a way, because Biden is happy to get away with more or less just a handshake and a photo op and dressing up a few already existing things and throwing a few other things in there to look nice. But so are they. Because as you point out, Rania, they are the handful of elites who benefit from the neo-colonialism that's ravaging the country, and they're happy for it to stay the same. And quite frankly, the leaders who aren't happy for it to stay the same weren't invited. So that right there should tell you something about.
You mean the Eritreans weren't invited?
Eritrea's not invited, allegedly because they don't have diplomatic relations with the United States, which is not exactly true. There's a charge d'affaires in both countries. Mali and Guinea were not invited because they're suspended by the AU for quote-unquote coups. But again, Chad has actually been given prominent billing in this. The president of Chad, who is a coup. It was a coup. There's nothing else you could say about it in terms of how he came to power. Chad also not suspended from the AU. So there's a whole range of reasons why these people are allegedly not invited, but when you look at the countries that aren't invited, it really isn't about governance. It's not about coups. It's not about who is in or out with. I think Morocco is actually suspended from the African Union over Western Sahara. I did not see the king there, but I think he might have been there. But nonetheless, it's all just an excuse. The people they don't want are the people who are the most critical of the French and the U.S. presence in Africa. And it really, you know, Lloyd Austin did this whole thing about how these African countries better beware of Russia and China, as if Africans are just children and, you know, can't come up with their own understanding of who's for them and who's against them. So more on this as we move forward. We're going to have to move to our next show, but next segment here on the show. But I think it's important for people not to get caught up in the hype. Most importantly, of this African U.S.-Africa summit, the hype is nothing. There's no change at all in the neo-colonial status quo of U.S. relations with Africa. And unfortunately, not much change at all in a lot of these African leaders who are okay with that. Well, We're going to move on to another critically important issue that's still ongoing. Here's another one, don't believe the hype. This is still happening. Railroad workers in this country, that's a tongue twister there, in this country are continuing to stand up, continuing to push for their rights on the job. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Ross Gruters, who's a working locomotive engineer from Iowa, and they are also the co-chair of Railroad Workers United, a cross-craft membership organization of rank-and-file railroad workers and supporters. It's been doing a lot of fantastic stuff around everything railroad connected. Ross, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Eugene.
Well, we are really honored to have you here. And I guess the first thing I want to ask you is the fact that the fight is still ongoing. I know there were rallies earlier this week. I think a lot of people saw the congressional vote and just kind of figured, I guess that's it. But it seems like railroad workers and their supporters are continuing the fight. So talk about where things are now and some of the things that railroad workers would like to see moving forward.
Yeah, most people, including our own government, probably thought this was over when the TA was imposed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden. But the truth of it is the conditions that we're working under and the issues we're facing don't go away because this contract has been enacted. And so it is incumbent upon us to continue to organize and bring forth the pressure we need to get those quality of life issues that we've been fighting for. And a lot of this was forced upon us in the name of the economy, right? We don't want to slow the economy down. Our kids need their Christmas presents under the trees. But the unfortunate truth is we're already facing the economic effects of what the railroads are doing. We're already experiencing empty shelves and soaring inflation. And that is due in large part to the fact that these freight railroads are using what should be critical public infrastructure as their own personal piggy bank.
I think that's... Oh, sorry, Ronnie, go ahead.
No, I mean, you finish your thought. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's really important that you lay that out because I mean, to me, it feels like this is one of the most, unbelievable aspects of this entire thing is these companies are so profitable and making such a huge amount of money, yet are totally unwilling to do, anything at all. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that because I think it's important to underscore how Scrooge-like, if you will, the entire approach the railroad companies have taken to the workers truly is.
Yeah, there's been hundreds of billions of dollars in stock buybacks, huge dividend payouts, and the industry is, in some places I've seen it reported as currently the most profitable industry in the country. So the railroads can certainly afford to give this what is largely a placeholder demand or a symbolic demand of paid sick time to their workers. That's sort of a stand-in for quality of life issues. And it's not just railroad workers who need paid sick time. It's all workers. And it is largely because more and more workers are being asked to do more faster with fewer people, regardless of what industry you're in. That pertains to railroad workers, certainly, but it also is true of teachers or nurses or the service sector or turn to wherever you go. And that's the case.
In terms, based on what Eugene just said, in terms of the owners making so much money, your organization is actually calling for public ownership of the railroads, which is interesting because, I haven't heard any politicians say this, and I could be wrong. I haven't been following everything every progressive politician has been saying. Perhaps there is one out there that has been making this demand. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Is there any person in a position of leadership in the United States, particularly, of course, the supposed squad members, calling for this? That's actually the first time I've seen it be called for, which is surprising because that would fix so many problems, I would assume.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Rania. And I believe you're right. I believe it would fix a lot of the problems we're having with the freight rail system, treating it just like we do any other public infrastructure like the interstate highway system or airports and ports. As far as support from politicians, I think behind the scenes, we're starting to build some of that support and work towards lifting that up as a national issue. But just like any other, that is a big step and a big change for this country. And so it's going to take organizing a movement of people who are demanding it. And the reason to do that is because these freight railroads are enacting such a high cost on all of us, on the general public. And you don't have to take my word for that. There was just an article in the Harvard Business Review, not exactly a lib publication, calling for the railroad companies to take heed and saying that while the federal government did avert a strike, that understaffing remains a hazard for workers, customers, and the vitality of the freight railroad system. And so it really is high time that railroads recognize that cost. And more importantly, as you're talking about, that the politicians start to recognize that cost and start to put the pressure on the freight railroads. We saw this week they have hearings in Washington, D.C., calling one of the carriers in to testify before the Surface Transportation Board about their practices of not moving freight rail, of embargoing cars and not shipping the freight that the customers are trying to get moved. So you're starting to see more and more questions being asked. It's time to start organizing and putting the pressure on to make that change.
One of the things I'm curious about is what the impact of all this has been in your industry amongst workers. I mean, I think that the stereotype amongst railroad workers for so many years was that, they're making a lot of money, they don't care about anything. I remember, a couple months ago reading somewhere, I don't know if it was Harper's, somewhere like that, an article that said, all they care about is can they get a new truck and more guns, or whatever with a higher paycheck. And, I think all of those sorts of things have been pushed to the side here because railroad workers have really come out into the forefront of our society. But, I think now we're seeing in elections that are happening in some of the unions and just in general with the rallies that are going on, it seems like a real ferment amongst railroad workers not to just let this lie, but that this has really been an acceleration point for people wanting to organize and to push back.
Yeah, it definitely has. And the work we do is extremely hard work, where the majority of the freight rail industry is on call 24/7, 365 days of the year, working holidays, weekends, nights, in the snow, in the rain. And we don't necessarily know when we're going to work a lot of times. It's largely dependent on when the trains show up at the next change out location. And because of these demands, there is a lot of fatigue, and it is a difficult job. And more because of the emphasis on cutting jobs with 50,000 people, 50,000 jobs gone from the industry in just a matter of about 5 years predating the pandemic. You see that pressure on workers to do more work with fewer people. And so there is a very real physical fatigue, but then now being pushed to the breaking point, there is also a lot of decision fatigue as well. So it can be a demanding job, and for it to be a sustainable career for people that they can hire out and work, say, 30 years and get to retirement age, things have got to change in the industry. And those things are beneficial to workers, but they're also beneficial to the public and the economy.
I think that in a lot of people watching this play out are very obviously supportive, I think, for the most part of the workers. How can you not be? I would hope so, at least. But of course, I mean, sometimes you watch from the sidelines because it seems like with these kinds of struggles, like unless you are one of the workers in this industry, there's nothing you can do. And so my question for you is, like, what can people who are outside of these unions and not involved in the railroad industry, what can they do to support this struggle?
Well, you introduced me as the co-chair of Railroad Workers United, and we do have Solidarity memberships if you're interested in staying in touch with us and learning more about how we're pushing back. And you can find us at railroadworkersunited.org or on Twitter at Railroad Workers, and of course Facebook and all the other social media sites. Staying plugged in and into it and knowing that this didn't end with congressional action, that we will be continuing to push. And this was on track, a 5-year deal enacted in the 3rd year. So we're just 23 months away from going right back to the bargaining process. And so it is incumbent upon us to continue sprinting through the finish line and continuing to bring people on board and getting folks involved. Like I said earlier, it's not just railroad workers that need 7 paid sick day a year. It's all workers. And so perhaps there's an opportunity to turn that into a national issue and a national campaign for all workers.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree wholeheartedly. And I'm burying the lead a little bit on this, but something you said, Ross, just struck me of being 23 months out is the very fact of this, Railway Relations Act, I believe it's called, or the Railway Labor Act. I mean, this law in and of itself, talk about that if you could, because, I mean, this just strikes me as just honestly draconian, the restrictions that it puts on workers just to exercise your legal rights to be in a union and to take collective action.
Yeah, and I'd just add that we're not the only ones. Railway labor is not the only workers affected by the Railway Labor Act. It's also the airline industry. And it's a long, convoluted process. There's a flow chart that looks like some Rube Goldberg. And the thing that folks need to know is that the Railway Labor Act, is designed to prevent workers from going on strike. That's why it exists and what it boils down to. So railroad workers, in the back of our minds, we knew that this process would culminate with the congressional action that we saw. We just didn't know when that would be and under what conditions they would force us back to work under a TA. In order for that to change, I think the best way we can help ourselves and help really the whole nation is to continue to organize and bring public pressure on politicians to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ross, we really appreciate you joining us. You guys at Railroad Workers United have really been doing the yeoman's work, I think, reaching out to the population more broadly and helping explain all this to us. So thanks so much for some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side.
Appreciate you both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ross has really been burning up the hours on media organizations and doing great stuff, and I really appreciate them being willing to join us. And RWU has been, really helping inform me on a lot of this. So I hope folks stay plugged in to what they are doing. I mean, unbelievable issue. Nationalize the railroads. It's an old populist slogan, reaching back to the 1890s if you want to do that. But just as fresh and as right now as it was then, that's for sure. And just like now, then it was brutally repressed when people tried to raise it. So, a lot to be said there. But I thought that regardless of what happened in Congress, I think the railroad workers really woke a lot of people up in this country, Rania, to just how ridiculous the situations are for so many different classes of workers and how much these bosses are just, Warren Buffett, so-called liberal, he was all about the tax thing under Obama and I should pay higher taxes. I mean, this guy is giving out billions of dollars in stock buybacks and doesn't want to give one paid sick day to his own workers for a fraction of the cost.
I saw this on Twitter the other day. I don't mean to glorify Scandinavian countries because I know they're very problematic. I just want to add that caveat. But I was scrolling through Twitter the other day and I saw this one tweet that stood out to me, and it was about somebody who had gone to work in the Netherlands, like an American, and basically saying like, I can't even begin to explain to Americans like how messed up their system is. When I went to go work in the Netherlands, I asked how many sick days I had, and apparently by law, well, the employer was like, oh, if you're sick, you don't come to work. And the person was like, okay, but how many days? But then apparently by law in the Netherlands, and again, this is based on a tweet, so I could be exaggerating, but you can if you're actually sick, you can get paid for up to 2 years.
Nice.
Like if you're so sick you can't go to work. I'm sure you have to like prove it. You can't just like go to the Bahamas and be like, oh, I'm sick. But the point is, it actually is amazing what we put up with in the US, like as like the supposedly richest country in the world. And then you have like Americans. I even remember, the few times in my life when I have gone on vacation, and I know that's like makes me a person of privilege to even have gone on a vacation because there are people who cannot. If you're ever anywhere in the world where people are vacationing and you bump into a European and you get to talking and you ask them, oh, how long are you here for? Oh, I'm here for a week. And then next week we're going here. And the week after that, we're going here. And after that, and you're like, wait, like what? These people will be on vacation for like 2 months because in other rich countries, they get like 2 months paid leave that's not sick time. That's vacation time. In the US, like there are so many people who don't have any paid vacation days, let alone paid sick days. Like it's so outrageous, but I think it's so normalized in the US that we don't know how outrageous it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, and look, in some ways, I think it's valorized in the United States because the perception, I think, is that Europeans are lazy. You know, like, oh, in France, they take a whole month off. They do this, that, and the third. And, Americans are always working hard. And this is what we do. This is how we are. And, yeah, anybody who's watching this, who's ever been on or known anyone on disability in the United States, that they will look for any excuse to yank that away from you, even if you are, like, truly injured and are no longer able to work. I mean, it really is unbelievable. But as always, Rania, this brings us to the end of our show. Sad moment for us, I know. Sad moment for those who are watching. But, of course, that's why we come to you every week. But before we go, as always, we want to remind you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. And you can become a patron and a donor. By the way, Matt Duenas and someone else, sorry, apologies, but I saw your Canadian dollar donation, 2 more donations, shout out to you. But to become an ongoing patron, you go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. And of course, you can find us at BT Newsroom on all your social media platforms. You're already watching us on YouTube, so you know where to find us there. So make sure that you hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you can get the alerts for all of the fantastic programming, especially Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And as always, we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe. We did it, Joe.
Let me be clear.
I'm just chilling in Cedar Rapids.
We'll do it live. Fuck it.